Story 1. The Challenger exploded. My dad let me stay home from school to watch it. I told him they launched fireworks instead because I was 6 years old and didn't understand what had just happened. Story 2. The Tylenol murders occurred in 1982. I was 6 years old, and I distinctly remember standing in the kitchen in front of my grandparents' refrigerator while this story was on the evening news in their living room. It's remarkable how certain details stick in your memory. Story 3. Columbine. It was strange to be watching it from halfway across the country on the midday news. I was 7. My mom said a serial killer shot up a school. I later learned the truth. Being a very literal child, I interpreted it as serial killer and said I hoped he didn't get Cheerios. I cringed looking back at that moment, but it's permanently filed away in my most embarrassing memories. Story 4. Baby Jessica fell down the well. For the longest time, I thought it was a whale, like something from the story of Jonah. Story 5. The Oklahoma City bombing occurred when I was in 2nd grade in Tulsa. I remember my dad picking me up after school for a dentist appointment. We drove by a local news station building, and he told me about the event. Story 6. I was in 5th grade and turned on the TV to watch Power Rangers after school, but instead there were live shots of older students walking out of their school with their hands behind their heads. I had never seen anything like it. Story 7. The Apollo moon landing in 1969. We had a black and white console television, all vacuum tubes. Back then, we only received 4 channels via a roof antenna. The 3 major networks, National Broadcasting Company, Columbia Broadcasting System, and American Broadcasting Company, and a local public broadcasting service affiliate. We lived in a medium-sized city. Rural communities were likely fortunate to receive even one station without excessive snow. AM radio was still dominant. At least 2 of the 3 networks had continuous coverage during the daytime. I remember watching for days on end. Shortly thereafter, unidentified flying object sightings became popular and were frequently reported in local and national news. The next major story I watched daily was live coverage of the Watergate scandal. With the old televisions, when there was a problem, we pulled and took tubes to be checked in a tube tester. If any failed, we went to the electronics store and bought replacements. Considering the lethal voltages inside televisions, I was taught how to safely drain capacitors with a screwdriver to make maintenance safer, although I was instructed to never play with the television except for adjusting the horizontal and vertical calibrations. Anyway, it was fun reliving those memories. Story 8. The Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam. My mother would have the radio on in the morning, and the announcer would state how many Americans were killed the previous day in Vietnam. I clearly remember black and white footage on the evening news of people in the civil rights movement being fire-hosed. The National Guard was present on college campuses, facing off with college students protesting the war. Story 9. Oh, this is a great question. I vividly remember Jonestown. I remember watching the news where they did the famous flyover of the compound, and you could see bodies piled everywhere. I'm pretty sure they showed the footage of the cult members opening fire on Leo Ryan and his entourage as well. They would show things like that back then. For example, when the walkways collapsed at the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City, they showed the rubble, and you could see pools of blood and limbs sticking out of the debris. Story 10. I'm 33. The O.J. Simpson trial captivated my family. You may say, wait a minute. If you are 33, that means you were around 4 years old during the trial. You are correct. I was 4. My family started noticing that I was gaining some information about O.J. When I named my black Cabbage Patch doll O.J., my family is not black. My mom thought it was important for me, a little white girl growing up in an all-white town, to have dolls of all colors. It only really backfired on her in that one instance. Story 11. When I was in 2nd grade, my teacher was watching the launch on a small portable television during a spelling test. I had finished the test early, so I watched with her. Story 12. The 1989 earthquake in San Francisco occurred while I was playing hide and seek. I initially thought one of the neighborhood kids was shaking the fort I was hiding in, until I realized it was an earthquake. I started running toward the house. I remember seeing my mom in the distance. Then she was gone, then I could see her again, then she was gone. Looking back now, I realize I was witnessing the earth moving in waves. It's the earliest vivid memory of my life. My dad was supposed to drive over the Bay Bridge that day, but he stayed home to watch the World Series. A large section of the bridge collapsed during the quake. Story 13. Weirdly, the earliest thing I can remember is Pee Wee Herman getting in trouble for something, but I was too young to know what it was. So I asked my mom, who, in a moment of panic, thought of the worst thing to tell a 6-year-old and said, "He shaved his neighbor's dog." 6-year-old me thought, this is a very serious crime. Story 14. The 2004 tsunami that hit Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand on December 26th was a devastating event. I was 8 years old and had received a cake decorating kit for Christmas. My siblings and cousins made cakes and sold them in front of a local store, donating the proceeds, which totaled about $17. Story 15. The assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan occurred, followed by the shooting of the Pope 2 months later. Both survived, but these events, along with the assassinations of both Kennedys and Martin Luther King Jr., made me realize that important people are targeted regularly. This understanding is part of why I am not the president today. Story 16. When Princess Diana died in a car accident, I remember coming downstairs early in the morning and my mother crying at the news on the television. Story 17. I have a distinct memory of seeing the Berlin Wall fall on the news. My parents recognized how significant the event was and wanted me to witness it. Story 18. Nixon resigning. My dad called me in from the yard, and we watched it together. He said to me, "That's what makes America great, I see. The fact that no one, not even the president, is above the law." I often wonder what he would think of Trump. Story 19. I was dropped off by the school bus after a hard day in kindergarten. Those colors weren't going to organize themselves, and someone had to solve the mystery of the correct order of numbers. I bolted into the house, ready to get a snack and watch my favorite show, Barney, the big purple dinosaur on PBS, the public broadcasting channel. My mom was in the kitchen doing her usual tasks. I had turned the channel to 11. It wasn't Barney. It was a group of people standing around the building I had seen a couple of times on different banknotes or whenever the news talked about the government. It was the U.S. Capitol building. A man with white hair was speaking about matters that weren't related to Barney at all. I asked my mom what was happening, and she said a man named Bill Clinton was our new president, and this was his swearing-in ceremony. Did the old president die? Why was he swearing? You're not supposed to use bad words. Why are they outside in the cold? But more importantly, why are they playing this when I'm supposed to be watching my favorite show? For a solid few years, I had great disdain for that man because he ruined one afternoon for me when I was 5. Story 20. Jamie Bulger. I was 5 and very good at reading, and really into reading the newspaper because that's what grown-ups did. I remember reading an article about it and understanding the words on a logical level, but not fully grasping the conceptual implications of 2 kids a bit older than me kidnapping a 3rd child and murdering him. I read about the entire situation in detail years later and was horrified that none of the adults at the time thought it was a problem for me to practice reading with newspapers that had that on the front page. Story 21. The Kennedy assassination. My dad was in the Air Force, and a few weeks before the Dallas visit, Kennedy came to the base. I was so excited, but when his car arrived, all the Schultz pushed past me, and I didn't get to see him. I cried and cried. Story 22. Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 5 years old and watched with my mother. She was glued to the television and wouldn't let me leave her side. What she knew but didn't reveal was that my older brother was on an aircraft carrier 20 miles off Cuba. Story 23. Steve Irwin died in 2006 when I was 7 years old. Many in Generation Z loved him and grew up with him. I think that was the first celebrity death I remember in my lifetime. Story 24. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the proclamation of independence for Ukraine occurred when I was 7. I didn't understand why only Swan Lake was on the television, why my parents were worried, or what putsch meant. However, I clearly remember how everyone around me was in high spirits when we learned that the Soviet Union had dissolved and Ukraine was now independent. Story 25. Watergate. I was about 5 and saw the hearings on television. I asked my mom what was happening. She said, "Those men lied." Story 26. The Dunblane Massacre. I remember my mom crying. It turns out future tennis player Andy Murray was involved. British gun law was tightened immediately, and it remains our only school shooting. Story 27. One of the cornerstone events of my early childhood was when my mother and I were at a restaurant. I asked her about the Iranian hostage crisis that was happening in the late 1970s when I was about 8 years old. A man from another table came over and complimented me for being aware and asking questions. That had a significant impact on me, serving as positive reinforcement for caring about the world. Story 28. I think about the 2000 Bush versus Gore presidential election. That was the first time I realized that the president is an identifiable person and not just an anonymous administrative position. I remember one of my classmates expressing relief at getting rid of President Clinton, while I had no idea who he was talking about. Story 29. The Kennedy-Nixon debate on television was my first introduction to politicians. I was 5 years old and knew nothing about politics, but I remember thinking that when one candidate spoke, it sounded pretty good. Then the other candidate would speak, and I thought the same thing about them. I have scanned a few responses and realized that I may be the oldest person here, which may not be a good thing. Story 30. The death of Selena was significant here in South Texas. I remember watching the news with my grandma because she was taking care of me at the time. Story 31. The Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania prompted a discussion in class the next day. My teacher was very upset, and when we repeated what we had heard about his difficult life, she said it was no excuse for his actions. It resonated with me that one can have a troubled life and still be a good person. The changes to our gun laws afterward prevented any further attacks of this magnitude in Australia. Story 32. Jeffrey Dahmer. I have watched all the true crime shows and everything on serial killers except the shows on Dahmer. I was 3 or 4 years old when he was basically in our backyard. I can't watch anything about Dahmer. It game? Very interesting. John Wayne Gacy. Absolutely. Dahmer? It just makes me feel like a scared little kid again. Story 33. James Bulger. His cheeky grin on the front page of every newspaper is imprinted on my memory like a high-definition image. Story 34. The Tutsi genocide in 1994 had a profound impact. I was only 3 years old, but I still remember many old memories. I saw dead toddlers on television, and the reporter mentioned that they were killed during their nap time. I asked my dad why they slept without clothes, and he explained that it's normal in hot countries. Although I understood they were dead, I was too young to fully comprehend it or feel compassion. The fact that they slept without clothes, unlike me, was what shocked me the most. Story 35. Waco, Texas. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians were smoked out of that building. I think I was around 9 years old. Story 36. A collision occurred between a Trans World Airlines Constellation and a United Airlines 707 over Brooklyn. Photos captured the only survivor on a Brooklyn street, a crying and bloody young boy who later died at the hospital. This incident caused nightmares for some time. Story 37. The Beetle occurred in 1992 when a plane crashed into an apartment building, resulting in numerous fatalities. I was 6 years old. Story 38. John F. Kennedy in his motorcade was coming down my street. It was big news for our town. I was about 5 years old, but I was too fascinated by the black and white cartoons on television to go outside that Saturday morning to witness it, like the rest of my family did. I wish I could say it was the last thing I ever missed out on. Story 39. The Oma bombing had a significant impact on my life. I was 8 years old at the time, and I remember my family watching it on the news while my dad tried to cover my eyes. Story 40. Susan Smith was drowning her sons. I remember seeing her on television begging the kidnapper to bring them home. Story 41. Mine was the abduction and murder of Polly Klaas in 1993. It was the first real news story I remember, and I was also from the same city where she was kidnapped and murdered. I was about 8 years old, and my grandmother drove us around the city trying to find her and the suspects. I was terrified. Story 42. First grade. I remember seeing the news about Steve Irwin's death on television and talking about it with other kids on the bus to school. He was a big deal to kids in the late 90s and early 2000s. Story 43. The first September 11th. The second was the Auburn McDonald's case. Something about it worried my mother so much that she made me watch it whenever it aired on television and told me that a boss or police officer can never make me take my clothes off. Story 44. The 1952 presidential election featured Eisenhower versus Stevenson. I recall some of the early Korean War. I used to help my mom bake oatmeal cookies to send to my brother in the United States Navy, who was stationed in the war zone. However, I really do remember the 1952 election. Story 45. TWA Flight 800. I was about 12 years old when the plane exploded. Growing up near the site, I thought we could help rescue people. I was trying to convince my dad to take the boat out and assist in pulling people from the water. Story 46. The 1992 Los Angeles riots. I seriously thought it was a movie for the longest time. It was absolute chaos on live television. Story 47. In California, I remember being afraid of the Night Stalker, even though children were not his victims. Additionally, the Michaela Joy Garrett kidnapping occurred in my hometown. Story 48. The Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, Australia, was a significant event. I recall watching it on television before school and discussing it with friends throughout the day. Story 49. I remember the execution of Gary Gilmore because we discussed it in 4th grade. In 1977, teachers could talk about the firing squad with 10-year-olds. Story 50. Baby Jessica fell down a well. We watched that for almost a whole day. Somehow, I missed the Challenger disaster the year before. Story 51. Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was killed. I had just turned 5 and was visiting my grandparents, who lived close to the border and had access to Swedish television. Story 52. Diana. I was 5 years old and used to get up early to watch television on my own. I remember greeting my mom when she woke up with, "Guess who's dead?" Story 53. This event is specific to Sydney, but I remember my mother being glued to the family computer for hours, waiting for updates on the Lint Cafe hostage situation. Story 54. The Vietnam War and the daily news reports of the number of troops killed were a tragic reality. It was a devastating time. Story 55. The execution of the Ceausescu couple was shown in the news in Bulgaria, where I lived at the time. I was traumatized for quite a while. Story 56. When everyone thought the world was going to end in 2012, I was lying in bed with my mom early in the morning while they discussed it on the news. I remember seeing videos of people celebrating, and I genuinely believed the world was going to end, which made me start crying. I must have been 6 years old. Story 57. Assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. Story 58. Without any television or anything else, we were very sheltered in the countryside during 9/11. I was so young, around 3 or 4 years old, in rural France. I didn't understand anything. I didn't even know that people lived and worked in tall buildings. I had never seen one. Imagine, I didn't even understand what a city was. But I remember that ringing telephone, my mom walking to it for the first time, her shock, and her expression. Then for hours after, all the calls came in, and my mom rushed to answer them, clearly worried. She and my dad tried to explain to me what was happening. I didn't understand why they were so anxious. Did we know anyone there? Well, one of my relatives related to my mom was a flight attendant, and she was supposed to be in New York at that time. That was my grandmother calling her to keep her updated since we had no radio and no television. Fortunately, our relative had changed her flight plans a few days earlier to go to another country she hadn't yet had the chance to visit. So she wasn't in New York. However, being in another country, dealing with jet lag, not understanding the language, and not seeing the news as it happened, she didn't have the opportunity to call us for several long hours afterward to reassure us that she was safe. So yes, that's how we experienced 9/11 in rural France. Story 59. Australian. Esso Longford fire in Victoria and the subsequent gas shortage. International. Diana's death. Story 60. The O.J. Simpson car chase and trial. I remember watching that on the news at the daycare my sister and I attended. Story 61. JFK Jr. died in a plane crash. I remember they interrupted Saturday morning cartoons, and 6-year-old me was upset, not fully understanding what was happening. Story 62. Malaysia Flight 370. I was 6 at the time. It's not as significant as other stories on this platform, but I may be the youngest contributor here. Story 63. The fall of the Soviet Union left me confused. I did not understand what it meant, but I could see that my parents were very upset about something. Story 64. The eruption of Mount St. Helens was astonishing. I was 5 years old at the time. I remember it due to the extensive coverage in the news for days. Story 65. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, followed by Hurricane Katrina, are the two biggest tragedies I remember. I was 5 when the September 11th attacks occurred. I don't have a memory of that event, but I do recall other things from that year. Story 66. I remember seeing news about JonBenet and hearing about Columbine. I watched the news on September 11th because I was late to school. Story 67. The capsizing of the cruise ferry MS Estonia in the Baltic Sea was a significant event. There were other major news stories before that, but I was too young to fully understand what was happening. Story 68. The Dutch Bijlmerramp, or Bijlmer disaster, occurred when an airplane crashed into a residential building. I do not remember the news of the crash itself as much as the investigation that followed. Story 69. Challenger exploded. My dad let me stay home from school to watch it. I told him they launched fireworks instead because I was 6 years old and didn't understand what had just happened. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.